amazing lineup. Continuously amazing lineup. So first we're going to start with record suspensions, and then Bob Chipman is going to do that. Conviction or sentence appeals, Erica is going to do that, and then humanitarian, compassionate, and temporary resident permits. Got those three just one after the other. So I'm going to introduce Bob. A lot of you seem to need no introduction to him, but Robert Chipman QC has been a staff lawyer of Nova Scotia Legal Aid since November 1991 and has spent the majority of his career in the Bridgewater office. Over his career, his practice has extended to cover nearly all of the services Nova Scotia Legal Aid offers to the public: criminal, child protection, family law, and summary advice counsel, including pensions, income assistance disputes, residential tenancy matters, and civil lawsuits. Bob had previously served on the Nova Scotia Barrister Society Bar Council for a 6-month term as a member of the Professional Standards Family Law Committee. Mr. Chipman assisted in developing the new province-wide family law practice standards. Donor for life, Bob has donated blood over 98 times for Canadian blood services. So welcome, Bob. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. I wrote that myself, so just take that with a grain of salt. I wanted to tell you two things about myself. My grandfather was an immigration officer at Pier 21, which is where over 1 million immigrants passed through between 1928 and 1971. I've always heard awesome things about my grandfather and how he helped new arrivals to Canada. So the stories that I heard the last few days, he wasn't like that. The second thing is I'm not an immigration lawyer, but there is definitely an overlap between criminal and immigration law. And in the last several months on our caseload, and I work at a small office and there are only 5 lawyers, 2 who do criminal law. At the present time, my colleague and I are handling 2 cases where non-citizens are charged with sexual assault. One a Syrian refugee and another a temporary foreign worker from Mexico. And in the latter case, I did the bail hearing. So increasingly, we have to work with interpreters and immigration lawyers. So criminal lawyers have to make sure that we're giving good advice on what we know, but not disastrous advice for the non-citizen. So that's really an important thing to know. So I'm going to be talking this afternoon, my first presentation, and then I'll be presenting with Erica on conviction or sentence appeals. The first is on record suspensions. So I'll just get this up. We finding it's important that lawyers must make sure that they inform a client of potential immigration consequences, and it is advisable to obtain a written direction from the client prior to any guilty plea and advise of all the possible immigration consequences in that direction. These are things that Christine dealt with on day 1, and a lot of the other speakers about the fact that people are divided into distinct categories under the IRPA. And of course, there are those terms that we're well familiar with, and there are definitely immigration law consequences of a criminal sentencing. And in Shirelli, the Supreme Court of Canada in 1992 said one of the most fundamental principles is that non-citizens do not have an unqualified right to enter or remain in the country. That's where record suspensions come in, formerly known as pardons. You would apply for them to allow the consequences of inadmissibility to be canceled and to allow for the immigration process to proceed. Now, there is you have to complete all sentences, including fines, surcharges, costs, restitution, and compensation orders, and you must finish all sentences of imprisonment or probation orders before you can apply for a record suspension. Now, you have heard about the case of R versus Boudreau of the Supreme Court of Canada, which came down in December. What that means is that the victim fine surcharges before October 13th, 2013, do not have to be paid. So your client, October 24th, 2013, these surcharges do not need to be paid by the client. What about a freestanding restitution order under section 738 of the Criminal Code? These must be paid before you start. There is also a waiting period for summary offenses, 5 years, for indictable offenses, 10 years, and the Parole Board of Canada charges a great deal of money to process a record suspension. This was like a 6-time increase in the record suspension cost that was brought out a few years ago. So there are also additional fees in obtaining fingerprints, copies of criminal records and documents, and local police checks. And it's an extremely kind of a complicated process for many of the clients, and there are of course organizations that assist in that, but I've been at the local police station myself for various reasons, and people have come up there asking how to complete these forms for the record suspension. Now, before I talk about that, I just wanted you to know that a client is not eligible for a record suspension if they've been convicted of a Schedule I offense, certain sexual offenses, and then more than 3 indictable offenses. The process can take up to a year. It takes 6 months for summary conviction offenses and 12 months for indictable offenses. And of course, as I pointed out, the cost is significant. You should know that they also have a discretion, the Parole Board of Canada, not to grant a record suspension. And that's because a person has to be of good conduct. A record suspension may be denied because good conduct is considered behavior that's consistent with and demonstrates a law-abiding lifestyle. As noted in the case of Buffone, B-U-F-F-O-N-E versus Canada, 2017, FC 346. The board is not subject to the same standards as a criminal court, so the court may rely on information that resulted in withdrawn charges. So, and they can revoke a pardon. So you have to be aware of that it may not be an automatic process to obtain a pardon. Also, the wait times are significant. Here is a situation where the impact of a record suspension is going to assist you because your client doesn't have to live with many of the consequences of having a criminal record. They can continue or begin the immigration process. And I'll give you a couple of examples. It will permit the application under Section 21 of the Citizenship Act to become a citizen. Remember that Scott was mentioning about the fact that when you are on probation, the time in Canada stops. So after you get a record suspension, then that is going to help you. It will allow you sponsorship of family members under Section 133 of the IRPR, and allow a foreign national found inadmissible for serious criminality or criminality to remain in Canada. Tips for criminal lawyers. Confirm your client's status in Canada. And as Christine said on Thursday, you should really use that checklist that she was using and make sure that you have documentation to confirm a person's status in Canada. Obtain an opinion letter from an experienced immigration lawyer early in the process. And even where an individual has been charged or arrested, I didn't know this until I became involved with the foreign national case I spoke at the beginning. There are requirements to disclose the information to immigration authorities. Even if you are doing a work permit, the guy's a seasonal worker, he's going to come back again in March or April. The question on the form is, have you ever committed or been arrested, been charged with, or convicted of any criminal offense in any country or territory? the answer, you have to answer that truthfully, and the client should be aware of that. There are a number of resources that are very helpful to the area of suspensions, and also to about guilty pleas and consequences of criminal charges on the immigration process. I would, and it's in the it's online, the CBA's Collateral Consequences of Criminal Convictions report. There's a whole chapter on deportation and immigration consequences of convictions, and I would highly recommend that. There's also the Record Suspension Application Guide, much of what I spoke about today, and there also is Immigration Criminality and Inadmissibility. It's a loose leaf product through Carswell, which is highly recommended as well. So I thank you for your time in this on this topic. And next, Erica and I are going to speak about conviction or sentence appeals.